introductory section has 5 parts. We've gone through leadership, markets, the third idea that is political culture. The fourth we're now discussing is innovation, and the focus on innovation emerged in the late 20th century. It became very widespread. The roots go much further back, and then where and why, but the idea in many ways it has transformed much ways of thinking and how to improve things about cities and the economy, about life. In part, it's also a reaction against a simple materialist, and sometimes Marxist, but materialist is much more general than Marxist. And so, instead of saying land and factories and tools are the main drivers of capital and of growth and of the economy and of the good life, instead, the innovations say no. Innovations come from our heads, from people, not from physical objects like that. Those same heads can transform the value, the interest, the uses of making land and of making factories and of making tools become much more productive. They can become much more able to do new things in terms of efficiency, cheaper, faster, but they can also add another section, which we're going to be the main next section is on the arts, is on consumption, and then and scenes. That is the idea of beauty. That this is not just a new way to make it cheaper, but what and this is the related concept which we'll talk about is amenities. That innovations can be framed in terms of economic theory as often an amenity. Innovations can drive innovations and make cheaper cars or faster cars, but they can also make a more beautiful landscape. They may add trees, which may have oxygen, but they may also have color and contrast and forms. In these ways, the Renaissance was a spark of some of this, with people like Leonardo da Vinci, who both could make gorgeous things in the ceilings of churches, but the idea that the world could really do things more dramatically and better came in, let's say, after many hundreds of years of a relatively stable, not in a narrow sense, but in a general sense that the whole world can drastically change. In rediscovering the roots of this in Europe, in the ancient Greeks and the ancient Jews. And this really got rediscovered in the Renaissance, and the painters, people like Leonardo da Vinci, and then inventing things. These then began to think about beauty as part of this. The French, Francis I was angry because France was not the first at doing this. So he tried to hire some of the Renaissance beautiful painters of beauty, and most of them said, "Oh no, I'm an Italian." But one of the very best was Leonardo da Vinci, and he became the artist of the King of France, not of Italy. And he brought with him the Mona Lisa, which in some measures may be the most prized painting in the world, and has decorated the Louvre, which was then the location, the king's house, then later on the museum for art. Where and how then did these move forward with the beginnings of the Renaissance? And after the French Revolution, 1789, cooks, seamstresses who made dresses, people who did hair, people who painted paintings, no longer were just making these for the king or the church. There began to emerge individuals, and so you could sell these in markets, which began to emerge more widespread in the 19th century. But you also had, in a sense, entrepreneurs, because these were the chefs, these were the people who made beautiful dresses, these were the people who made new wines, new cheeses, or better ways of making a gorgeous dessert. And I'm speaking with these examples because they had been the prized things which made the courtiers around the king, which really made this so distinctive. And I'm explicitly pointing to examples including the arts, aesthetics, along with efficiency, numbers that can more simply be counted, and so forth. Over the 19th century, many kinds of innovations then came along with electricity, railroads, later cars, bicycles. These began to transform the core of the economy, many activities, but it was the 20th century, in the mid to late 20th century, that this began to be more generally recognized. And one who was widespread and having impact was Jane Jacobs, who wrote a book on the life and death of great American cities. So cities were then seen as a distinctive location for innovations. And so let me just say another person who wrote a bestseller was by Richard Florida, same name as the state. And he did a book on the rise of the creative class, which had a resonance with Marxism, with classes, but he didn't write the book around that at all. It was the publisher that said, we need a new title that's more catchy. And so they put the class in the title, but the book doesn't say very much about class. It's all about innovation. And that was clear later on. He came and spoke in one of my classes as he was just coming out with it. Three of us began to work along similar lines: Richard Florida, Edward Glaser, and myself. And we then did this book I was the editor of the Cities and Entertainment Machine, which focused on these innovations along with consumption. But what I want to do at this point is introduce Richard Florida. If we could play that, we'll see. This will be a little later. Can we do Florida now, please? Then we'll talk about. Then we'll come back to that. Sorry. Yes, that's perfect. Yeah, so you got the time, not just at the beginning. It's okay, terrific.
For the past 50 years. Now look at what national governments are doing to try to rebuild.
Can we make it any louder?
Oh, we have to have stimulus programs that build us more.
is your volume on max right here on your computer?
Already projects,
Yeah.
more roadways.
Yeah, see, you're using your speaker rather than over here. I think there's another way to do it, but I've forgotten what. Okay, for now, just get, do you see, is there a volume place there?
Maybe they need a
That's fine, so just let's go with that, yeah.
More highways. We have to support the housing market. I'll get to this in a minute.
Okay.
But the housing,
Why
auto,
don't you come a
energy
little closer with your
complex was
cameras,
the pinnacle,
because for
the fundamental driver,
the videos.
the fundamental social and economic and spatial underpinnings of the mass production industrial order that is collapsing all around us. This economic and social transformation to human intelligence, to knowledge and creativity is more dramatic than any economic transformation that ever happened before. Now think about how painful it is. Think about the things William Blake wrote about when he wrote about laboring in the Satanic Mills. Think about the challenge Marx and Engels wrote in the Communist Manifesto. Think about the fundamental economic crises. Two world-encompassing depressions, major world wars, and this economic transformation, I would submit, is a more fundamental break with the past than any of those others. Now where is this conversation going on? In what national capital are people talking about how to build new social, institutional, spatial underpinnings for this new kind of economic order? That's the conversation we need to begin. And hopefully my work in the Great Reset can help to ignite or catalyze that conversation. Now I don't want to bore you with too many statistics, but I do want to give you a few which will enable you to understand the magnitude and scope of the transformation we have gone through. In the year 1900, more than 50% of Americans worked on farms. A growing number of us worked in factories. Less than 5% of us worked in the knowledge, professional, and what I call the creative industries. That's science, technology, research, development, entrepreneurship, management, the professions, arts, media, entertainment, and so on. By the year 1950, we had become a manufacturing economy. Less than 5% of us now worked in agriculture. More than 50% of us worked in or around the factory, the industrial economy. Less than 10% of us worked in the creative economy. Beginning in the year 1980, our economy begins to undergo this transformation. Between 1980 and today, the U.S. economy generated 20 million jobs in the creative sector of the economy. Science, technology, management, law, healthcare, arts, entertainment, media, and design. Today, more than a third of the workforce is employed in these fields. In some of our biggest cities and metros, it's more than 40%. Less than 10% of Americans work in direct production occupations. 22% of us work in blue-collar work broadly, which includes construction and transportation, moving, and logistics. 1% of us work in agriculture. During the course of this economic crisis, the rate of unemployment in manufacturing, in production work hit 14%, in construction hit 20%, and the knowledge and professional and creative jobs it's yet to hit 5%. Over the course of the next decade, we will generate another 7.5 million jobs in the knowledge, professional, and creative sector of the economy. Those jobs already account for 50% of all wages and salaries paid. These jobs are the driving economic force of our time. And we have to understand their dynamics and how to harness them. They are what has created the wealth and prosperity which has driven our economy. Now, people hear me talk about the creative class, and immediately they generate two kinds of criticism that I think it's important, because we're here today, to address head on. The first criticism I found fairly easy to address. It has come from the socially conservative right. And it hinges on a simple finding that my colleagues and I found almost now a decade ago on the relationship between open-mindedness and social and economic and demographic diversity and places that can harness technological innovation, entrepreneurship, and human creativity. What we found very simply, there's a fellow named Scott Page who wrote a remarkable book called The Difference, and he documents average income, the gay index. Well, people went, by the way, I've never had my work challenged on the grounds of correlations being spurious. You should have seen the backlash that came even from the academy. And it's the most careful, my colleagues did the work, were extremely careful patricians, but the backlash was astounding. So what did I get? Does Florida really believe that people with, street guitar players and communities with street guitar players and buskers have an advantage in economic growth? Come on. What he's talking about is downtown San Francisco. Silicon Valley is a nerdistan filled with engineers who don't want anything to do with this. Florida has unveiled.
This was the finding when he published that made him quite infamous, because people said it can't be true. I mean, so everybody said this is just seems impossible, including me. So I said, could I check your data? And they said, sure. Here's our data. So they sent it to me. And so in this book, The City is an Entertainment Machine, there's a chapter, the main chapter, which found that had that finding. Richard Florida and Gary Gates, Technology and Tolerance, the Importance of Diversity to High Technology Growth. So Silicon Valley, computers, high tech. Where do you get more of this? And the quick answer was places with more gays. And so sexual orientation was not, they didn't argue that gays were engineers, but that this was like a canary, an indicator of tolerance, of thinking, acting, and tolerating many different kinds of doing things. Okay, the idea sounds fine, but is it really the right way to study, to bring in gays in that way, as he talked about in the gay index? So I gave it to a student, said, why don't you work on that? Doesn't he have something spurious here? And he worked on it for 6 months, and he said, no, everything's fine. I can't see anything wrong. So let me have it. So I worked on it over the weekend, and I found if we look at education and we control other things along with gays, we find that the gays were high. It looked at in many analyses which the student did. It looked as if Florida was right, but when you looked a little more closely, and the details are in the next chapter of the book, gays and urban development, how are they linked? And the answer is gays are spurious, is the quick answer. That is, the real driver is education. And education is what is also called by economists human capital. And so the details of that statistically is very clear and simple and straightforward. Basically, look at both education and gays, and you find it's really education, which is the more important driver. And then we begin to add a lot more about extending this, so I would say Florida was right on about creativity, right on about innovation, about ideas and the like. And the big reset away from industrial, away from agriculture, that's gone way down in terms of the size of the labor force. And these creative jobs, including entertainment, including aesthetics, those are major drivers of the economy now, and when were minimally recognized or accepted at the beginning, but are now being paid much more attention, and we're getting more and more evidence for things like this. If you look at Wikipedia, open to just click on Richard Florida and look at criticisms, which he was referring to. He got a lot of criticism, But who did the first and the most substantial criticism was Terry Clark in this chapter right here. But we still were and maintained good relations and trying to say we're working along similar lines. But he made a mistake, and he didn't want to recognize that. So he was on the television program of Colbert, very popular TV program, and Colbert read up on this and basically said, "You really are wrong. Shouldn't you recognize that?" No. Okay. So the issues in science, you make mistakes. If you try out new things sometimes that don't get recognized. But if the author himself doesn't recognize it, that's why science encourages other people to, including checking numbers, redoing it, making sure that something's right, and it can lead to very different perspectives. Okay, staying with the bigger ideas, which were introduced there in terms of the transformation of the economy. What the next reading is, can Tocqueville karaoke? And what it points to with Alexis de Tocqueville with a microphone and maybe dancing or singing, doing some kind of karaoke. He was French. They don't do karaoke in France. How can you learn karaoke? Well, it's a little bit of a historic transformation, but it does right in pointing to Paris, because the French have two big theories which relate to these huge transformations. First in the economy, which Florida was really talking about, and the second is in politics. And they're two big theories which are, in a sense, have flaws or limitations, and they both developed with France and with Western Europe evidence, examples, historic cases, and so forth. But in both of them, when we and others took them to Asia and said, do you do these things in Asia? And such as Florida and I were meeting, for instance, in a big meeting with the mayor of Seoul, Korea. And there were a couple of hundred people. It was more than that who were in the big audience, but the speakers were maybe 20 or 30 people, many of them really trying to say where and how can Asia and how can Korea and Tokyo, Beijing, Shanghai, how can they continue to be successful and grow faster and do more things more successfully than the West, or catch up and go ahead of them was the question. Florida's answer, gays. One thing we said, how are gays treated here in Korea? This was 20 years or so ago. Well, there was a well-known television announcer, speaker, more than an announcer, but the star. He came out as being gay. He was fired. He could not get a job anywhere in the media, and he committed suicide. That's how Korea treats gays. Florida said, they don't get it. He got on the next plane and went home to America. I stayed in Asia and I said, listen, the Asians are doing something very, very right. We've got to understand how and why are things different in Asia. And we need to look at the theories, the big theories, and see where and why we need to tweak them or transform them. And so let me give you a little bit more background about these two big theories which are in the book for politics and economics. So they start with the economy. The economy is in a sense, Florida talked about the 19th and 20th century more. If we go back a little bit more, as I did talking about the chefs, the ends of the court, the rise of markets, some of the leading artists who were making money successfully from markets were Dickens in England and elsewhere where they spoke English, and Balzac in France. And Balzac was the most successful, highly regarded novelist in the French-speaking world. And he was very then outspoken in saying artists need to be able to have new ideas. We need to write about these ideas to give you new, beautiful, interesting plot themes, peoples, and situations. It makes people think about different things, but also we may challenge the bourgeoisie, the proper middle class way of doing things. And if we want to let artists be free to do whatever they want, they can be more creative. But you can't just be criticized because they have long hair or have tattoos or something else like that. We want to let them do whatever they want. And one way is to have a neighborhood which is separate, where we encourage diversity, tolerance, and artists can do whatever they like. And so he lived in a neighborhood of Paris called Montmartre. Later on it became the Latin Quarter. And so that idea of having a neighborhood be particularly spearheading, or think of Silicon Valley or Wicker Park here, or New York, Greenwich Village. These are classic examples of Bohemian lifestyle, and that sort of led Florida to think of the gay index. But what he called his data for Bohemia were simply jobs in art, and not everyone fits in that well. So I'll just give you a little bit more, as we'll go more about some of this. With the second figure was Baudelaire, the late 19th century poet in Paris. He was the most charismatic artist for young people in Paris at the end of the 19th century, and he wrote about the attractions of seduction, of the street prostitutes. He had a couple of lady friends who were prostitutes. He didn't have a happy suburban, if you will, 2 children, a dog, and a TV, and a car. No, he was living the lifestyle of Baudelaire, but the point was he was popular because so were many other young people interested in exploring more diverse lifestyles, including gays, including a wide range of things, including emotions and feelings. The subjective began to take off. This was the late 19th century, led to Freud, led to the stream of consciousness writing, and leading into new topics which were considered taboo in previous years. So this in turn got picked up by Walter Benjamin, as we'll talk about that in the next section. But the Benjamin's theory was to try to crystallize. He was considered by many the smartest intellectual in Weimar Germany. So German. He wrote a book on Berlin. He wrote a book on Moscow. He then came to Paris, because Paris does not fit with Marx, even though most of the intellectuals, and he himself, was considered a Marxist. So Benjamin was, looking at Paris. They didn't have factories. They didn't have smoke. because that was ugly, but they had an economy that kept on going. How did they manage to do this? Through the 19th century. So the ideas and the innovation of these kinds of people from Baudelaire and Balzac, and then the Italian opera, La Bohème, these began to make intellectual meat, if you will, of these ideas as new ways of doing things, and the term Bohemian came in the late 19th century, and having this meaning. When I went to Asia, various times, and worked with Asians who came here, I would say, "Do you have Bohemians in Seoul, in Beijing?" People said, "What's Bohemian?" They never heard of it. They didn't do it in Seoul. But they had a very successful economy. They had some great art. They had all kinds of things going on. How could we change the theory, or what's wrong with the theory if it doesn't hold in Asia? That was one question. Let me then flash over to the other theory, and then we'll come to the three parts of the book. First is the economy with the Bohemian lifestyle, Balzac, Baudelaire, and the like, leading to arts and to innovation. The second was Tocqueville, the French analyst, who went to America and published, is still the most famous book about democracy in America. How is it different from Europe, and how is it the future of Europe? And are these aiming about right for me? You're not cutting my head off. That is, yeah. You can see from yourself. Yeah, just look. I mean, you can see it. It's okay.
Yes.
Okay, that's fine. The first session we cut off my head for a good chunk of the time, but it's good, so we can come over here. This is what we'll use to summarize Tocqueville's simplified theory, which is that I'll point to it. Models 1 and 2. Civic participation can lead to many outcomes, but those were stressed in a positive way. That Northwest Europe were high on both civic participation and building trust and legitimacy among citizens. Citizen participation, thus, was stressed by Tocqueville with the metaphor or the example of two Massachusetts, because he mostly focused on New England for this part. If you had a farmer and a person who had cows and bulls and animals, and the one would eat the corn being grown by the farmer, and so the two farmers get together and say, "Why don't we build a fence together? And then we'll be good neighbors." And they do it, and they build trust by having average citizens collaborate, and this in turn, as it grew, was civic participation. Especially in America and New England, these were in churches, little churches. There were lots of little churches, and people knew each other and they would bring in God as part of these discussions. But the average citizen participation was critical, and was pointed to by Tocqueville, because in France, civic organizations and any kind of church except for the Roman Catholic Church, you could be killed for. The Protestants in France got killed off. Some of them ran away, got outside, and then some of them would go to Switzerland, like Calvin. So Calvinism emerged from a different French priest, but the point is the negative case was Latin America. If you ask people in the U.S. or France or Germany, how much can you trust people in general, your neighbors, your political leaders, the press, the police, and maybe half of Americans, half of the French will say maybe half the time. You go to Sweden and Norway and Denmark, and 90% of the people said yes. People in general are good, and especially our leaders do good things for us. If you go to Latin America, you do about 10%. 80, 90% of Latin Americans said, no, you can't trust anybody. Okay, so there are big differences. And you also find in Korea, we had a PhD student here who was Korean. He found that civic participation in Korea was higher than in the U.S. Koreans are more active in churches, they're more active in civic groups, of alumni clubs, all kinds of things. The Koreans join those, and especially churches like New England, they're more important. But those Koreans who are more often to be members of a club or a church or these things do not hold more legitimacy for their leaders or for one another. So in that sense, Tocqueville's wrong. If he'd gone to Korea, he would have found different things and realized this. And it wasn't just Korea. We had the data were collected. He was working here as the National Opinion Research Center, and he had data for lots of other countries. And the same thing fell. Go ahead. What do you have to? The same countries had the same pattern of no relationship, zero from civic participation to trust and legitimacy. Portugal, Brazil, Russia, China did not have any positive relationship here. There were other things which which did generate trust and legitimacy, but not, that is, the work groups. People would work together, and in much of Asia, people would work together very long hours, and after they finish 8, 9, 10 p.m., traditionally, they would go out and have several drinks, have dinner, and sing karaoke. They would build solidarity among one another. They trusted each other around the work group and about these personal relationships, which did build solidarity and trust among Asians in ways that didn't exist at least it was not visibly there important. But this in turn had these two French theories, two cases of failure in Asia in the ways that they were normally done in the West. And they in turn led us in this book. We worked for I think 14 or so co-authors. They're mostly Asian, and then people from Portugal, because Portugal and Brazil were like Korea. Things didn't work. Even though in Spain they were closer to France in this way. Civic participation did build trust. The person who was the political scientist who were continuing the Tocqueville theory most seriously was Robert Putnam at Harvard. And he published, he'd written a very good book about Italy. He's a very smart guy. But then I would say he wrote a bad book, but it became his most popular work, and it was called Bowling Alone. Bowling Alone, which was he found when he grew up in Ohio, and he was a small town, and he went back and he bowled with a league, that is a group of young kids, young guys, young men would get together. They'd go bowling and enjoy each other's company several hours. So he went back, as he had good memories of this, and talked to the owner and said, how's business? Oh, it's terrible. Really? What's wrong? People are no longer bowling in leagues. But I still see a lot of people here, oh yes, but they're bowling alone. That's the problem. Why is that a problem? They don't drink any beer, they don't have any food, they don't talk to each other, they just bowl alone. And so the metaphor is, that's the problem. We don't have trust because we're all bowling alone. Okay, so he has data, he got a lot of data for the numbers of people who were members of civic organizations. He counted them all up, and he measured trust in the same sorts of ways that lots of other people were doing. Ask about many different kinds of trust, police and political leaders and so forth, the church. And what he then showed was membership in these civic organizations was going down. And we all are showing less and less trust over time in the U.S. especially, but also we had a little bit of international data, but it was especially in the U.S. Less membership, less trust, and this ought to lead to the loss of legitimacy and the lack of institutional support, and many people would point today to the U.S. and much of the world as going through exactly this. And maybe this is related to bowling alone, an individualism in a sense. One person who immediately disagreed was Richard Florida. Florida was, Putnam was a small town Protestant, and he was a Calvinist in background, religious background. Florida was Italian, Roman Catholic, lived in Newark, New Jersey, close to people like the mafia, people in a closed Italian Godfather, famous film, illustrating the style in which Florida grew up with. And Florida said he hated it because it discouraged innovation. You didn't want to you weren't told to do anything different, and you were punished if you really were innovative. Whereas if you went to places where people were more different, we can encourage more of this kind of lifestyle. So he, in a sense, was breaking away, and we had this kind of debate going on. So we got Florida's data, we analyzed, and we showed how Florida had a mistake. We got Putnam's data, and we did this in similar kinds of things. We went further, and we said, first question was a very simple question: how do we measure organizational membership? Not just total adding them all up, but why don't we look at types of membership? Let's look at churches. Let's look at unions for workers. Let's look at neighborhood associations, and all of these were what Putnam said. But then we looked at arts organizations, entertainment, cultural activities, music, bands. It was the opposite. These were taking off in the last 20, 30 years. So maybe if Tocqueville could learn karaoke, and it was doing karaoke in Asia, then the arts could substitute for, that is, the Asians went for drinking and having dinner. They did not do this as a member of an organization, as a civic organization. They worked as workers. So they were it was, and it could, in that sense, undermine the union as a separate organization, as is found, say, in much more in the West, especially in Western Europe, where they have very difficult union battles and so forth. What I'm getting to from these two examples is that both these theories were partially right, but also had a big hole in them, and we found by working with a number of smart people that if we found other kinds of things, including bringing in the arts and membership as organizations, we can transform the political system, and we can build more legitimacy. And so, for instance, we even have people like Bill Clinton going to Hollywood, trying to have Hollywood stars or play in a band with him, or he would invite them to Washington. Obama would dance with his wife. That is, the arts were actively used in the West to celebrate and try to build legitimacy. And it works. That is, it works in part because this kind of, these are important, especially for younger people, and in that way, the arts can work to fill the hole of what can build legitimacy in the political system. Within the economy, the same is also true, in the sense that we don't just look at money, at holding a job where you may not do anything significant, but what do you do in the job that you add value to what your company or your job is doing, whether it's building a fence between a farmer and a herder or something else. And in that way, if we then ask, where and how might the artists interpenetrate the economy? Florida talked about some of this descriptively, but the point is, instead of looking for one factor like that, such as gays, is the wrong approach. So what we have done, joining us in conjunction with this, with the idea of not just something, but the interpenetration of karaoke linked with working together, building relationships which are personally legitimating strong and continuing personal relations. That's part of an Asian model, but we have it everywhere, not just in Asia. So why don't we look at say, some organizations like bowling leagues, and if bowling leagues are going down, other things are going up. And so there may be people who sing together, choruses, people who perform together in a theater. These kinds of things can be playing the role of replacing the role, and how about social media on the internet? Social media, thus, are a critical way of building relationships of trust and solidarity. Question Go ahead.
Do you think that social media is a positive thing?
Positive or negative, and the answer is the quick answer to what we say here and then here is it depends on what the content of the social media or the content of the organization was focused on. So if we don't just go to Asia, but we say within the U.S. or within in Germany or in France, how about gangs? Gangs may be robbing, stealing, murdering people. Is that good for building trust or happiness or low crime? No. So we can have institutions everywhere in the world, and they also work. They may work as social media. So I won't say that it's Terry Clark, say it's good. The way we generally approach things like this is to say, what do different subgroups feel that it is good or feel that they do trust? So, and find out there in conjunction with that, where and how do these different subgroups fit with a particular style of activity. So, for instance, as I drive down I live in Bronzeville. It's an African American neighborhood, and I've lived there most of my whole adult life at the University of Chicago. And I've lived, and I'm very active in civic groups, and I learn continually. And one is there's diversity, but one was that rap songs were developed by young, tough men who often used four-letter words and talked about the many seductions of women in which they're successful with, and so forth. And so rap got a bad image. As I drove today from King Drive, there are many signs by a guy who's running for office for the school board. He ran for alderman about a couple of years ago, and he almost won as alderman. And his name is Rhymefest, Rhymefest. He's a rap singer, but he created in the world, he's famous because he created gospel rap, musical rap, that is Christian rap. And so he mixes together the same kind of rhythm, the beat, the etc., the dancing, but he says, God, why don't you help me out? I need assistance. The devil's giving me a hard time. He brings in God and the devil in the rap. And so he and a couple of others led to rap being at least generating a subgroup of ways in which the Christian, that is, most of the singers, young African American musicians, composers, singers, people who want to make videos and attack even other young people or gangs, but they the bringing in of the Christian, that is the background for many of these young people is the church and their mothers. They may sing gospel in a church, and they grow up with music, which is, and they grow up about the Bible and a minister telling you, lead the good life, do the right thing, work hard, you'll succeed, and so forth. And the mothers and their daughters work well on that. The young men do not. Young black men have much higher unemployment more crime, more difficulties with the law, etc. And so the idea that maybe if we can, that is, somehow put these things together, he and they, and we have this with rap singers around the world, developing new ways of singing and bringing in different messages. And so to answer your question, the type of social group, I'm generalizing to say it's not just, I'm agreeing with your point, it depends, and it's not just having the beat or noise or dance or whatever, it's whether if you support a Christian ethic of, let's say, proper lifestyle, that's the opposite message from what was often and is often in much of the rap music. And so we have ways in, so the general point, which is what this is making, is the first model of civic participation can lead to trust and legitimacy if they are part of a scene, of a set of activities where people may be together doing things where they build on one another's solidarity, as with karaoke, with a work group, which generally has been successful in building trust. Whereas by contrast, gangs or terrorists or others, thieves, if you're brought up with those activities and you're more active in a gang, you're more successful going to prison, and you meet a lot of other prisoners and you say, I robbed more banks than you. You know, I had more millions of dollars which I stole, and I got away with it until the last one. Okay, so that if people then learn, and this has been true for hundreds of years, prisons are really great places to learn how to be a better criminal. Okay, so that's the opposite of Christian rap. So the point is, if the scene, and this is the what we'll get to in next session or so, will be the scene with its interrelated values can transform the workings of both the economy and the political system. Okay, let's just have a little bit of Theaster Gates, and then if we can, or let me, I'll pause if you have a little bit of discussion, but we'll bring in Theaster if we have time. Anything either of you want to raise, as I've explicitly brought in Asia and mentioned the arts, and we'll hear more from your personal engagement with each of these things. So you're as our now officially introduced as our teaching assistant. Tell us how you pronounce your Yuhan Kai.
Yeah, Yushan.
Yeah, what's that? Yuhan, do you say? Yushan?
Yushan.
Yushan. Yushan?
Yeah.
You pronounce it as an S? Yushan or
Yushan. Yeah.
Yushan. Okay. Yushan. Okay. Anything you want to follow up on?
Actually,
Or let me even say one more thing. You have 10 papers in draft. You're very creative. Most of these you've written in the last year. There are many focused, very interesting, but largely, just looking at the titles, they look very separate. How could you put them together, or can you find some bigger theories, which we've been talked about more here in these examples from Florida and from Tocqueville, Baudelaire, and so forth? These theories, how could they, or might any of these connect with some of your, and of course, and you've also won many prizes as an artist. How can you connect these with the other kinds of things like bicycles, renting bicycles, or crime, or other things which you're paying attention to? I don't want to put you on the spot. I really want to ask you to ask questions or try to, but I'm asking questions to try to connect the pieces and to connect Asia with the West. That's the big issue.
From that example, are you saying that, like, because they gain trust and legitimacy through other facets of life, if they speak on something else, they're still respected for that opinion? Does that make sense? Like, if they're like a prominent artist, like, so for example, like the modern day age, like Taylor Swift, and like Taylor Swift tweets out something, she has a lot of trust and legitimacy and like a huge fan base, so like, she is able to influence a lot of people. But I'm kind of confused on like what the next step is of the point that I have to understand here.
No, yeah, I would agree with the empirical observation. She's highly charismatic. I would also push on a little further, however, and say there are other popular stars, and she is closer to middle class women in their values than young, tough, macho men doing normal and listening to normal rap music. And so in that sense, I'm endorsing very much your shouldn't say endorse, I'm celebrating with the same example. Can I tap just on the space bar? I'm just going to keep this here going. No, that's fine. I'm just keeping that there. Yeah, but we'll bring in the next time about the context, but let's talk for it. It's good to have a little discussion and going right to that is what we can look at are different kinds of artists and you can read, say for next time, and we can talk about it a little more. Theaster Gates is an African American potter. He makes pottery, but he also has he's won prizes as the most successful, influential artist in the world. And he grew up as the son of a guy who put tar on tops of roofs to stop to stop water from getting into the roofs. It's a dirty job, manual labor, difficult. He was not an artist, but his son did become an artist and has been very, very successful in building and transforming things. So he does not just pottery. He also does painting. He also he leads a group of musicians. He goes singing around the world. He's ironic and teasing people. He can use the Bible because he's steeped in, like most young African Americans, he was brought up with the Bible, usually with his mother, and in that way he can do this. So he says, I gotta rush to Lake Michigan because Noah's Ark is getting us on board, and it's raining. It's going to be. We can be saved, but I don't know if I can get through the streets if I get shot on the way to Noah's Ark. And so he's mixing together the tough street life with the Christian metaphors to talk about what works in the hood and so forth. So he's successful, and we'll see a little bit more in the future. But the point I'm making, which he articulates, was trying to do good things in terms of good is defined differently by different subgroups. And so Taylor Swift is hugely successful with some people as an audience, but there are others who may be women who are a little more seductive and thus seen as more risque, less properly middle class than Taylor Swift. At the same time that the rap singers celebrate as well, being cutting corners, etc. Does that follow up?
Yes.
That is that there's more in all of these readings, which elaborate these multiple ways. But I'm trying at least to get the big blocks of variables. Not to say that, and then the later the studies within here and we're reading will have ways of measuring them, counting them, and seeing how strong are these arrows, and why, and most of all, why do they reverse from positive to negative? And so the main answer that I'm giving is the bigger sets of underlying values and norms about a norm sort of is saying, don't cross the street if the light is red. And that's a simple example of a norm. But the bigger values like egalitarianism or trust or legitimacy can come out and connect either with these kinds of norms and values, and institutions like gangs or bands or karaoke with people's jobs, or you can also sing karaoke as a family or with other kinds of institutions as well. Any other follow-up? How does any of this resonate with what you're doing in your own life, papers that you're writing, other books you're thinking, and that is, how can you use different theories which are widely taught and widely used? Where and why do they work for the world that you have seen yourselves, or data which you've seen and analyzed, and which especially may be in your case for Asia? Why is Asia different? And where that is, many people say, oh no, China's different. China's unique. That's Chinese. Western things won't work in China. Maybe, but the question is why and where, and can we look at specific variables like trust, legitimacy, and where and why these dynamics are the same, or are they different? Yeah.
I went to Japan for the first time last summer, and it was really interesting to me how different their day-to-day lives and also like their societies function, in the sense that you can go pretty much anywhere in the US and see trash on the street, or just like things in disrepair, things that are like ugly to the eye. But in Japan there was pretty much none of that, and my dad and I even went to some of like the seedier, what they consider seedier parts of the country, and it just doesn't compare. And in terms of like,
Sorry, you missed it. What's the word? You went to you said something.
more seed.
Scenic.
No, seed, like as in like sketchier, like more like dangerous areas. What they consider to be dangerous, which is Shinjuku. That's like the red light district.
Okay.
And bringing that to Asia as a whole, I think that in a lot of my classes, we talk a lot about like the East versus the West, like how the concept of the other. But I think that in what is classically known as the East, to this day, we still have a lot of cultural values which we can't.
I don't you turn the camera to, okay. Can we let people see that face for a little bit? Okay, these excellent points, but go ahead.
Which we can't like rebel against or push back or so ingrained that it's just how things are. And I think that growing up in America, specifically in a less Asian neighborhood, a lot of those values, like, I don't really feel like exist. For example, and I'm kind of rambling a little bit at this point because I'm trying to connect a lot of different points that aren't fully fleshed out in my mind. But when I grew up, I was never allowed to talk back to my parents. If they told me to do something, I'd do it instantly. If I said like why or like can I do it later, that would be a big problem. And then I'd go to like some of my friends' house and like they'll tell their moms to go fuck themselves and like nothing happens to them. So I don't know. I think it has a lot to do with long-held cultural values, which kind of shape the differences between comparing East and West. If that makes sense.
I've said basically the same thing. But adding as well, it's not just the values alone, it's also the way they work in specific practices, like does your mother or father say, will you wash the dishes after the meal, or will you clean up your dirty clothes on the floor in your bedroom or something like that. So in that sense, the two big examples which are widely studied and pointed to are the greater degree of social solidarity and interrelations, that people's personal relationships are stronger, more intense, and more meaningful, and leading to more trust. So even if people are social solidarity is but I mean we do have aspects of that. People vary in high or low. You can study that all around the world, but that's one. The second, just on your dependent variable of trust. If you go to the railroad station in Tokyo, people have a suitcase or two suitcases, and they have a lot of stuff packed, but they don't want to take them on the train. They don't check them in a check room. They put it on the floor in the middle of a huge room where you can just leave it. Bicycles, dozens of bicycles have no locks on them in Tokyo. Imagine that in Paris or London or Chicago. It'd be gone in a minute. The trust of the Japanese for one another is huge, but that is much more than in Korea or in Beijing. So trust is not shared everywhere in Asia, but it's extremely shared. And so where and how the specific variations among Asians are certainly important, and Asians too often focus on one country, but comparing the Asian variations from city to city, neighborhood to neighborhood, and then with the West as well. And especially when you have younger people who are disagreeing with older persons, and many of the younger now are moving in a sort of social media, individualistic direction. People often talk about it as the West, but it's not simply the West. It's different ways of thinking, but exploring where and how these work are exactly what we did for about 10 years in working on this book, having exactly these kinds of conversations as you're seeing in your visits to Japan. Okay, good points, good discussion. We will continue on Wednesday.